Well, next week, the new Archbishop of Canterbury will embark on a 6-day pilgrimage as part of her spiritual preparation for her installation service at Canterbury Cathedral on the 25th of March. Dame Sarah Mullally is the 106th Archbishop of Canterbury and the first woman to hold the role. She and her husband Eamon will walk 87 miles, or 140 kilometres, along the Becket Camino from St Paul's Cathedral to Canterbury Cathedral. Alice Loxton is a historian and patron of the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is dedicated to modernising the ancient practice of pilgrimage. Her latest book, Eleanor, a 200-mile walk in search of England's lost queen, saw her follow in the footsteps of the funeral procession of Eleanor of Castile, the wife of King Edward I, from Nottinghamshire to London.
She died near Lincoln in a little village called Harby, and they took her body to Lincoln and then they carried her all the way to London, where she was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 17th of December 1290. And 734 years later, in 2024, I completed that route and I followed in the footsteps of the funeral cortege. But what was so extraordinary, what really caught my eye, was that this was a story about the grief of King Edward I, who is mainly known to history as a terrible warrior king, but actually within this pilgrimage, we saw his deep love for his wife. He wrote the words, "Eleanor, whom in life we dearly cherished and whom in death we cannot cease to love." And he expressed that grief by building along the route 12 so-called Eleanor crosses, these great stone memorials in towns like Grantham, Stamford. And it was, for me, a moving thing to do, following in the footsteps of our ancestors' grief all those years ago. And that's where people talk about the difference between walking and going on a pilgrimage. They often say walking is for the body, pilgrimage is for the soul. And I certainly felt that on my walk.
You've written that pilgrimage is needed more than ever. Well, what did you feel that you gained from that?
I'd say it was one of the greatest things I've ever done in my life. And I know that that sounds a dramatic thing to say, but it was certainly true. It's something that will really stick with me for forever. And the wonderful thing about pilgrimage is it's taking you through these places which are sacred and which have been sacred to people for hundreds of years or even thousands. I mean, we're talking not just cathedrals and churches, but holy wells, ancient trees, ancient springs, stone circles. And this is something which people for thousands of years felt moving. And so perhaps it's not surprising that you do feel that when you visit yourself.
And the new Archbishop of Canterbury's upcoming journey is a well-trodden pilgrimage, the Becket
Yes.
Way. Tell us more about its history.
Yes, so this is one of the most famous routes, I suppose. Canterbury has been an incredibly important location in the Anglican Church since 597, when St. Augustine arrived in the Augustine mission to establish Christianity with the local people. And he was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And that's a long time ago, we're talking the 6th century. But it was also became very popular and important in 1170 with the murder of St. Thomas Becket. And 3 years later, he was canonized. And since then, this has become the destination for pilgrimage routes. And it became one of the most important pilgrimage routes and destinations in Europe in the medieval period. And you can even tell that when you go to Canterbury, because there's a set of steps where they're so worn down that it's called a sea of steps, because it's almost become this smoothed surface. And that's the mark of all the pilgrims over the years. Pilgrimage has a very unique history here in Britain because it was banned by Henry VIII in 1538 during the Reformation. But to see that the Archbishop of Canterbury is doing this herself is also a real marker, I think, that pilgrimage has had a bit of renaissance, if you like. So I suppose we're seeing the work of Henry VIII and the Reformation being unwound before us.
Why do you think it is having that renaissance? What is it appealing to in us these days? What is it we want from it?
King Charles III also mentioned it in his speech at Christmas. So there is definitely a movement, I think, towards this. People often, they're just sort of realizing that actually it doesn't necessarily have to be this really intense religious experience, even though it is, of course, rooted in Christian medieval habits. But it can be something that's just a day long. The best pilgrimages I've been on had often just been one day, walking from the outskirts of Oxford in, or from Roslin Chapel in Edinburgh into the centre, St Mary's Cathedral. And they can also be 30 days long and covering the breadth of Scotland. But the big mantra for the British Pilgrimage Trust is to bring your own beliefs, so If this wants to be a great kind of Christian moment for you, it can be. If you want to try and reconnect with something at a time of your life which you're finding difficult, perhaps you're dealing with illness in the family, or perhaps a great change in your life, pilgrimage can be a great answer for that. So it's really open to people to experience it in whatever way they like.
Historian Alice Loxton. Our closing headlines: Donald Trump has called on the